Even Izuru wasn't certain he was fully human anymore, after what the steering committee had done to him, but he knew he shared the same functions as one. He still needed food and sleep, albeit perhaps a little less than average. So rather than tend to his survival separately, Izuru migrated to what he had unconsciously deemed Nanami's room. He would spend nearly all his time in there watching over her anyway. It was simply logical to bring all the necessities he needed as well. He left his bed behind, simply dragging one of the spare cots next to Nanami's. He carried 2 portable fridges, one stocked with food, the other stocked with extra blood. O. He'd looked up Nanami's blood type as soon as he could and found she was an O. Changes of clothes, and a laptop that allowed him to continue his observations of the school in his spare time. Their security was so lax that even if he hadn't had talent, he could probably have hacked into their system. That was all he brought, but that was all he needed. As for where he got everything, well, Hope's Peak Academy was so busy in the wake of murders, they wouldn't notice a few stolen amenities here and there. Over the next 3 weeks, he watched Enoshima wandering about with her muddied memory and false life. He watched as the Reserve Corps students' parade grew steadily worse outside the gates, as the main course blissfully pretended nothing was wrong, as the board lied and covered up their corruption, as the media started sniffing around. The world was slowly succumbing to chaos and despair, but inside the hidden room with Nanami, that world didn't seem to exist. He'd expected that caring for her would soon grow boring, like everything else. Probably even faster than normal. She was comatose, unresponsive, unable to provide the answers he so desperately wanted. And while the routine quickly did become boring, it didn't become a chore. Each action had so much weight for her survival, and that made each action precious. Every day he swapped her IVs, at first giving nutrients in addition to blood and crystalloid solution, then solely nutrients when her intravascular volume was within acceptable parameters. Washed her body with a sponge, cleaned her wounds, changed her bandages, and disinfected everything that entered her proximity. Once her stitches weren't at risk of tearing open, he adjusted her body every 4 hours to prevent her from getting bed sores. He monitored her body temperature, blood pressure, respiration rate, and pulse rate, marking even the most minuscule of changes in a log. The constant surveillance gave him very little time for prolonged hours of sleep, so he sustained himself through multiple cat naps, nodding off lightly in his cot. It was good that things were uneventful. It meant that her body was healing smoothly, even if her mind remained unresponsive. A combination of the oxygen deprivation, blood loss, and general emotional trauma had sent it fleeing to the depths of unresponsiveness. But by his estimate, she should move from her coma to a persistent vegetative state in a week or 2. From there, it was simply a matter of waiting for her to, quote-unquote, wake up. When he wasn't treating her, monitoring the school, or tending to his own needs, Izuru would stare at Nanami for long periods of time, one hand playing with her hairpin as he watched her chest rise and fall. He often pondered the mystery of her and her behavior. Even unconscious, she fascinated him. Despite being in the midst of what had to be terrible despair, betrayed by her teacher, locked in a death maze, tortured and left to slowly bleed to death, she hadn't succumbed. She had pushed through unfathomable odds, all based on a hope to see her friends again, with a shocking kind of fortitude. And then there were his own actions. Never once in his existence had he been pushed to act in anything other than self-defense. But with Nanami, it hadn't even been a question. He'd wanted to save her, and he had. Could that be classified as hope in a way? Could hope be as driving as despair? He sighed, pulling himself out of his musings so he could start his daily examination of Nanami's injuries. They were healing well, he noticed as he swapped out the bandages. The laceration on her forehead was the shallowest and faring the best. It had scabbed over, the skin around it pink and puffy. A few stray hairs were sticking out to the edges of the wound, and Izuru brushed them away. Once he'd done so, though, he inexplicably found his fingers lingering, stroking her pink strands. Red eyes examined them curiously. This was something he found himself doing occasionally, his touches turning to caresses without his permission. It confused him why, but he found the action soothing, grounding in a way. so he permitted himself these irregularities. Philosophy aside, there was still that pull to her, that bone-deep need to ensure she was all right. This tenderness that welled up from out of nowhere when he gazed at her sleeping, fragile-looking form. The tightness in his chest whenever he'd thought of how she'd almost died, not just by Enoshima's hands but by his own inaction. It was maddening in its unfamiliarity, and at the same time fascinating. She was an unknown variable, one he wanted to solve, to analyze. Why she cared, why she struggled, why she so strongly believed in hope. These things piqued his curiosity. For once he was curious about an individual, and about the feelings she could stir in him, not the ones she was showing him, like Enoshima, but actively making him feel, for either no logical or a highly improbable reason. He had questions, and for once he had no answers. But no, Izuru thought suddenly, inspiration dawning as he recalled a flash of red hair, fed from the security footage. Perhaps that isn't entirely true. It was perhaps the only time he'd left the complex since he started watching over Nanami. Izuru didn't intend to be away long. He knew where the amnesiac Enoshima was going, and he knew the fastest way to get there before she did. So when she arrived at the corridor leading to Matsuda's office for her appointment, flipping through her notebook, he was there, waiting, a black shadow on a white wall. The girl faltered when she saw him. Can I help you? She attempted a brave smile, even as she took a step or two away. All the nerves in her body were buzzing uncertainly, even if she didn't know why. All she knew was that this young man had a certain presence, a presence that scared her. He studied her with unnervingly piercing eyes. Does the name Kamukura Izuru mean anything to you? She shook her head slowly, frightful eyes darting around as she clutched her notebook to her chest. Ikusawa Mukuro. Shake. Enoshima Junko. Shake. She peered up at him, a bit fearful at his reaction to her lack of knowledge on these people she should, apparently, know. His face was completely blank, unreadable, and it only made her more agitated. Look, she stammered. If we've met before, don't take offense that I don't remember. I have a really bad memory, so I'll just look through my notebook. The stranger snatched it out of her hands, crossing the distance between them in the time it took her to blink. No, wait, please give that back. I need... The redhead looked around wildly. He was gone, completely gone. How could anyone just disappear like that? And he'd taken her memory journal. She could feel panic starting to swell in her. She was already starting to forget what he'd looked like, and then she'd forget he was there at all, and then she'd never get her journal back, and then... Why are you standing about with your mouth gaping like a fish? It makes you look dumber than usual. She wheeled around and... Oh, the heavens were parting. The sun was smiling. Matsuda-kun was standing before her. His handsome face was scowling, as usual, and her journal was still gone. But he was here, and that was all that mattered. Everything would be fine now that he was with her. Everything was always fine when he was with her. Matsuda-kun, it was terrible. There was some guy, I can't remember what he looked like, but I know he was here, and he took my memory journal. It's gone. We have to find it. He stole it. He scoffed. Or you just dropped it, you idiot. Eh? She turned to see it lying on the floor behind her. She blinked. How did you get there? Wasn't someone else here? But when she picked it up and flipped to the latest entry, there was no mention of another person. She frowned, feeling a vague sense of uncertainty, as if somehow that shadowy person was important. But if it wasn't in her journal, it wasn't important to her. And if it wasn't important to her, it didn't have anything to do with her, and so she allowed the last vestiges of memory to slip away. She clutched her journal to her chest, bouncing on the balls of her feet, blissful to have it back even as she forgot why. Matsuda-kun was turning back to the door, holding it open for her. Maybe your brain's finally breaking down and now you're hallucinating as well as forgetting. Hallucinating? Hallucinating what? Huh? That sounds scary. I don't want to start hallucinating. As the two entered the examination room, Izuru emerged from his hiding place in the shadows, head cocked. So that was Enoshima without her despair. It was fascinating how similar she was to the Enoshima he'd known, still vapid and peppy, but much less sadistic. He'd already seen how despair could warp a personality, first with the student council, then with Class 77. But it was something else to meet a person twisted by despair, then meet their original self. It offered a different perspective, and he valued perspective. And there was something else interesting too, the very thing he'd come here to test. The confusion in her eyes when he'd recited those names hadn't been fake, and neither had the panic she'd shown when he'd taken her journal. She genuinely didn't remember anything of him, her sister, or even herself, and she genuinely believed the lie she was living. But he'd recognized the emotions in her eyes when she'd beheld Matsuda. They'd been full of admiration and happiness and love. She couldn't remember what past she had with him, probably couldn't even remember why she loved Matsuda, but she still did. Every single memory she had been stripped away, yet that emotion survived. Just like me. If the memory erasure had failed to take those emotions from her, then it was logical to conclude it had failed to take them from him as well. The paradox he'd hypothesized was true after all. He retained Hinata Hajime's feelings for Nanami Chiaki, and judging by some of the patterns and connotations of his behavior around her, they were romantic in nature. He retained Hinata Hajime's romantic feelings for Nanami Chiaki. Izuru turned the sentences over in his mind, a bit of uncertainty prickling at him. He had the root of his actions, now, but what was he supposed to do with this newfound knowledge? What did it change? Nothing, he finally concluded. Knowing that he was romantically attached to Nanami surprised him, certainly, but nothing had really changed. He still wanted the gamer to survive, he still wanted to get the chance to talk to her, and he was still willing to look after her. His goals were the same as before. All he'd done was put a label on his motivations. So quietly, he melted away to return to Nanami's side, leaving no sign he'd ever been there except for a slight scuff on the floor. End of Chapter 2. Author's note: a persistent vegetative state is actually what most people think of when they hear the word coma. A coma patient is completely unaware of what's around them. A patient in a persistent vegetative state is aware of their surroundings, they can hear you talking to them, for example, but they're still unresponsive. Comas rarely last more than a month, but a persistent vegetative state can last years. Izuru strikes me as the kind of guy who wouldn't deny any emotions he feels. He's driven by logic, and denying something's existence in the face of supporting evidence isn't very logical. That doesn't mean he has any idea how to handle them, however, or that he'd ever be ruled by them. If you're wondering who the characters in the last section are, they are Ryoku Tonashi and Yasuke Matsuda, the protagonists of Danganronpa 0. If you haven't read it, I recommend you find a translation and do so. It's very good. Though if you haven't read it, well, I just spoiled the biggest twist for you. Sorry. But I couldn't resist giving them the cameo they didn't get in the anime. One look at Yasuke through a window doesn't count. And I wanted to draw comparisons between Ryoko's situation and Izuru's.